Great. Excellent. It is so wonderful to have you all here. I think we are going to probably have some more folks join us in a few minutes, but I want to go ahead and get started. So just FYI, I said it once before, but we are recording this session. If you would prefer not to have your image on, you're welcome to turn off your camera. We'd still love your participation. That would be fabulous. So today, I'm Una, by the way, for those of you that don't know. Hi, Cindy, welcome. For those of you that don't know, my name is Una. I'm an operations strategist at S2. I help with our events, which are online now. So today is a conversation called Why Do We Need to Be Resilient? And Em is going to be co-hosting, co-facilitating with me today. So Cindy, I just wanted to let you know, because you just joined, we're going to be recording the call. So if you are sweet, love it. Glad you're here. Excited for your input. So a little quick breakdown. We're going to have a discussion led by Em, and then we are going to have a little 2-minute community questionnaire, followed by a 10-minute section, which is going to have both responding to some questions on your own and then sharing out to the group. And that will become clearer as we go. I wanted to start this off. Most communities, most progressive organizations do a land acknowledgement before beginning their programs. And we are also doing that. And today in particular, May 5th, is a day of recognition for missing and murdered Indigenous women. The topic we're speaking on today as well is can be a heavy one. We're talking about PTSD, we're talking about trauma. And sometimes when we do these land acknowledgements, the story that can happen is that that Indigenous history is a traumatic one. But I've heard it said differently, and I prefer this way, which is that settler history is the traumatic one, and Indigenous history is resilient. And so the trauma that Indigenous women face now is they are 10 times more at risk of dying from violence than the national average. It's an endemic. It's its own kind of endemic. It's something that is not getting enough airtime. It's something that is not getting enough acknowledgement. It is something that falls through the cracks when it comes to our justice system. So I am going to be including in our chat a group called Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. They are doing really amazing advocacy work and as well as legal work to support our communities. So that's there. I would encourage everybody to go check out their work. Please consider donating whatever you can to help them, especially right now in times when resources are especially stretched thin. I want to say thank you to Indigenous folks that are joining us, that have joined us in the past, for the vibrant contributions, the contributions that they make presently. When we do a land acknowledgement, it is not something in the past. It is something that is ongoing. It is something that we hope to continue to serve and be adaptive to and to understand better as we continue doing our work, because we know that this work is worth doing and that we can do it together and we need to. So yeah, please take a look at that after our call. I appreciate you all being here. Em, I wanted to pass it off to you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Una. So just to reiterate what our purpose is here today. These sessions we started at the beginning of all of the COVID everything, of taking our We call it S2 On Air, and we as a cohort, as part of Sustainable Seattle, we are talking through kind of all of the kind of issues that have been coming up within the context and framework of resiliency and within the Seattle area all the time. So partly we just wanted to break those conversations open to our community and to have these conversations with one another, but to also hear what others have to say. It's kind of part live processing. I think there's not a lot more that we can do in this time with such new information coming out every day. I think it would be presumptuous to think that we're doing anything more than just processing day by day. But it's also meant to be a very tactile response and a very tangible response to breaking down what resiliency looks like in our region, building resources that can be useful to the community that gathers with these conversations. The reason that we're recording the session today is because we're also going to share it after the afternoon of Tuesday. So if you're listening to this in the future, hello from the past. And we are also going to be doing some resource mapping today. So we'll be doing some on-site real time today. We're also going to be doing some outreach, extended outreach to our community. And in addition to kind of an overarching idea of how we understand and trace resiliency resources, where they're present and where they break down in our region, which is our primary emphasis as part of our COVID response at S2. We are also, you know, I started that sentence with a really good ending and I lost it halfway through. So I'm just gonna keep going. I do want to mention as well that I have the rest of it now. So in addition to kind of having a big picture that's guiding us through this process, we have also set up a structure that can be very adaptive to new information as it lands in our hands. And that's how we ended up with this topic and this theme today. We had originally been planning on doing a session about West Coast alliances and kind of federal, regional, localized, and sub-community responses to the pandemic and what resiliency looks like. But a few days ago, late last week, this article came out about complex PTSD and the role that that is serving in moments of disaster and pandemic. And this, I will disclose, when I read this article, this brought up a lot for me. It made sense of a lot of things that had been really confusing for me in the last few weeks, the way that I have responded to the crisis. And I started kind of assessing that within the context of community resiliency and sustainability and disaster preparedness, which is a huge part of what we do. That opened up a conversation within our team and harkened back to how we began this annual year in January of 2020 with a conversation that we called fast disaster, slow disaster, no disaster. And that was a conversation that we aligned with the 10th commemoration of the earthquake in Haiti, in which we discussed how does infrastructure, how does social structure, and how does environment all coalesce to underscore different types of disaster? And how does building resiliency create the conditions for a no disaster world, which is what we would consider a truly sustainable environment? The title for this session, why do we have to be resilient, came from that session and a comment that our co-host, David Pierre-Louis from Kaitita, who I think is on this call as well, has brought up a few times, talking about the experience of Haitians and kind of this constant referral to resilience and saying, oh, these communities are so resilient, they're so resilient, they're so resilient. To Una's point at the beginning of this discussion, and as we think today about missing and murdered Indigenous women, they're so resilient, we're so resilient. But resilience is an adaptive skill. It is, as the article alludes to, a superpower, but it's also tragic. And we wonder, yes, we might be resilient, but why do we have to be resilient all the time? We don't want to have to be resilient. And a lot of the work that we want to discuss and a lot of the intention of the resource mapping is to create conditions for a society, for a structure, for a region that is preemptively resilient, that our structures are resilient, so that we don't need to internalize that resilience. That resilience doesn't have to come from trauma. That's utopic, it's idealistic. You know, we need to acknowledge that these adaptations and these resilience practices and the things that we learn through trauma are hard and painful and necessary, but we believe that part of our work in creating a sustainable Seattle is to be proactive and preemptive as much as we can to alleviate harm and suffering as much as possible. So that's the groundwork that I wanted to lay about why we're having our session. I want to give just a few minutes if anybody has any questions, and then I'll move on with setting some framework more specifically about social resiliency, and then move into the conversation around CPTSD and climate work. And then after that, we'll move into the resource mapping. So does anybody have any questions or clarifications? You can either say them, I'll give about 10 seconds, or you can type them into the box. Great. I'm also going to do one little plug. Today is, as you've probably heard, Giving Tuesday Now, an effort to support nonprofit organizations all around the world with doing a spring campaign inspired by the traditional fall Giving Tuesday for nonprofits. So today is Giving Tuesday. Tomorrow is also Seattle's Give Big Day. And we are doing a spring appeal to try to offset some of our revenue losses as a nonprofit organization. If you are able to support, I'm going to share the link right now. We really appreciate your support to be able to continue doing these resiliency projects for our region and to be able to both aggregate the information that we need for our resource mapping and also distribute it to the people who need it most. So thank you for your support. We also have a membership program that I can talk about later on in the session. So I am going to start with, actually, Una, a question for you. Do we want to put forward our preliminary question we brainstormed yesterday?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I don't have it in front of me. Do you? I apologize. Great.
Yeah. So we wanted to kind of offer a prompt or a question for the group to start with. I'm going to post it in the chat. And the invitation is to kind of think on this throughout the rest of the session and draft up your own response either for yourself or something if you want to share what comes up for you with us so that we can record that. That would be appreciated. And the prompt is this. If we think about CPTSD as an adaptive response, what does adaptation look like on an ecosystem or natural scale? What does adaptation look like on a municipal scale or a citywide scale? What does adaptation look like on a community scale? And that community could be geographic, it could be demographic, it could be identity-based. And what does adaptation look like on an individual scale? So I want to keep that really open. Again, we're talking about CPTSD as an adaptive practice. You could take that lens as you reflect on this question, or you could think about adaptation in other ways. And what we've been really curious about is kind of how the individual can scale to the environmental and how the environmental in response can be reflected in the individual and how these things work in tandem to create resilient societies. And that leads me to contextualizing this topic that we work with a lot, which is social resilience. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to share some resources that, full disclosure, I stole without permission. So I did ask for permission, but I just never heard back. So I'm going to pump up the person that I borrowed these materials from, Catherine Peinhardt, a researcher and urban planner in public placemaking. I saw Catherine speak a few weeks ago, and she is doing tremendous work around public place, public space, and resiliency. And while her background comes from climate resiliency and environmental preparedness, her research right now is focusing on this idea of social resilience. I'm going to trust that you all can see my screen. If you can't, somebody pop off mute and tell me because I can't see you right now. So this idea of social resilience is something that has become popularized in partnership with infrastructure resilience. So examples of infrastructural resilience are like green spaces, gray spaces, like levee walls, for example, are an infrastructure piece to prepare for disaster, right? There's all kinds of mitigation projects that are going on in technical innovations around water use efficiency, infrastructure pieces, public space, especially as we prepare for the effects of climate disaster. How can we build an environment around us that will keep us safe? But more and more, the conversation has been, I will say it's not new, but it's being more and more validated, that social resiliency is a really key instrumental piece of this. Here are some definitions of social resilience. This idea of social cohesion, foundational factors like common values and civic culture, domains like social networks, capital, and place attachment and identity. Social capital, the idea of productive value of social connections, and social infrastructure. So the idea that physical conditions determine whether social capital develops. So the ways that we're able to interface with each other. A great example of social infrastructure and technological infrastructure interfacing are the ways that we've all had to buzzword pivot in the face of COVID, and the ways that we've been able to continue engaging interpersonally to be able to respond to really pressing physical needs. If those social structures are not in place, and where those social structures have been ruptured, we see an increased impact in climate disaster and the impacts of climate disaster. Another definition from Eric Kleinberg's heat wave: a strategy of resilience will involve more than changes to our physical infrastructure. Increasingly, governments and disaster planners are recognizing the importance of social infrastructure, the people, places, and institutions that foster cohesion and support. And this final image is just kind of a rendering of what that looks like, that we need that social capital overlapping with social cohesion, overlapping with social infrastructure, yield social resilience. So that's a little bit of background. What time is it? 3:18. So at this point, I have some prompts for discussion based on the article. Can I see everybody if I click on this? I cannot. I would like to know, of the people that I can see, let me just see. Let me do view by default. No, I can't see everybody. I just want to get a sense if people were able to read the article, just to see, because I'm going to be referencing the essay a lot. If you did have a chance to read it, can you just put your finger up? Okay, so there's a lot of folks who haven't a chance to read it, which is fine. That means that I'll just give a little bit more context and pull some quotes from it. So the article identifies the common characteristics of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The most common of these are hypervigilance, an anxious kind of tethering between past and future. So I had this experience in the past. I'm afraid that this will repeat in the future. That means I have to be ultra prepared today. And it's often identified as maladaptive. One of the things that the author Stephanie Fu mentions is that PTSD is only a mental illness in times of peace. Our bodies and brains are consistently attuned to war, so we look paranoid and hypervigilant in peacetime. But in times of crisis, PTSD is an incredible survival mechanism that our genius bodies created to help us adapt. So in pandemic times, she says, I'm not hypervigilant, I'm responsibly vigilant. My CPTSD is helping keep my household safe. And again, just a show of fingers, I wonder if this resonates with anybody who's on the call, if it's something you've experienced yourself or it's something maybe you've observed in others. So for some folks, yes. The other factor that she's observed is that people who have not had a diagnosis of PTSD have often been exhibiting the same trauma responses, the same adaptive responses now that she experiences all the time. So we are in a traumatic moment, kind of a unique collective stressful traumatic moment, but not all, but many people with diagnosed CPTSD, anxiety disorders, and OCD tendencies have actually experienced a sense of calm in this time. And that's because many people with this diagnosis are in such a heightened state all the time that the crisis moment is actually matching and their adaptation is serving them. This is what the adaptation was designed to do. And what we're curious about is what can we learn from this, both in this moment to prepare for the ongoing impacts of the pandemic as we go further down the line? And what can we learn for this in disaster relief and preparedness work, in social resiliency work, and in climate adaptation work? So I'm going to start, that was a lot of information. I'm going to start with that prompt, and I'd like to just open it up for some floor discussion, just a few minutes. And just to simplify that prompt, can this type of adaptation be thought of as resilience? And if so, what does that imply? Can adaptations like PTSD be thought of as resilience? And if so, what does that imply?
I wanted to say, feel free when you pop on, just say your name, give pronouns if you'd like as well. Something that comes up for me, when we talk about this is adaptation being a short-term response, and how does that factor into long-term solutions? Mm-hmm. That's another question that comes up for me. Mm-hmm. I want to offer too, if people don't feel like they have like a full cohesive thought on this or a full response, because it is sort of a neat imaginative practice. What are some adaptations you've noticed, mm-hmm. like yourself, or in like your communities? The one that I've been thinking about a lot is the way Governor Jay Inslee was responding to this, and just like the way that he held himself during that most recent conference he had. Just using a very calm and soothing voice, thinking about things like that. What are some things maybe you've noticed?
I'll say something. One of the reasons this really resonated with me is a lot of my colleagues have been talking a lot about having these feelings of guilt at this time, which has been kind of to me, that was a surprising emotion. That's not, and I'll self-disclose, I have a anxiety and CPTSD diagnosis, so that's one of the things that really resonated with me, and I connected with Stephanie a lot and kind of her feeling of calm. So for me, seeing so many people talk about feeling guilty, having heightened sense of anxiety, not knowing what to do with themselves, was surprising to me, and I was having a hard time empathizing. And then I think there's a lot of factors going on there, but one of them that came up was maybe because I've had to do a lot of work around being able to, like, I'm always kind of at such a state of heightenedness that I'm able to kind of settle into this more. But yeah, that was something I'd noticed that really surprised me, that, when I would spend time like, going to the store for supplies, or responding to people in my community, or observing kind of the needs and the rapid pace of things that were coming out, that felt to kind of match my energy level. Whereas I noticed other people around me kind of feeling over.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I've kind of noticed for two general responses to the pandemic. One, and both are, quite validated, but, sort of one response is like this feeling of like missing out, like people no longer are able to go outside, they're sad, they're like, oh man, there's so many things I can't do. And then there's that other party that responds, and it's like, you can still go outside, like you're not trapped inside your home, you still have sort of these additional capacities that you could function in. Like, we understand that times are tough right now, and conditions are not normal, but there are also very special things sort of around you that we haven't really acknowledged and really gave time to. And some of those things was just like, I was even thinking about every day that I look outside, I try to go on more walks in my neighborhood, and I was just like, I realized I don't really do this. I didn't really do this in the past. Like there are so many times where I never really just explored my own neighborhood. And I also noticed how many more people in my neighborhood were also out, and how many more people were having conversations just across the street or, door to door. And I realized like this is probably the most promising time for like our neighbors to even learn each other's names. Because before that, it never seemed to click. And that was sort of just like a really interesting thought for me on just like sort of processing that adaptability in really positive ways. And sort of people can either take it and see like there's a lot being lost, which is in fact very true. But then at the same time, there's room and a possibility for smaller things, but just as special to be gained. And so that was just sort of like an illuminating insight for me.
I think that's a really great point. And I think that we are seeing, what I hear you describing, Tyler, is that idea of social framework and social resiliency that we talk about, that if you don't know your neighbors, you don't know how to check on your neighbors. If you don't know your neighbors, you don't necessarily know what resources might be needed from others in your community. And a lot of our structure has been set up in a way that really resists knowing neighbors. I think the next layer that we put onto that is how do we understand ecosystems of support within our neighborhoods and our sub-communities. So, what kind of superpowers, to use Stephanie Fu's word from this article, might exist within your own community? If there are people within your community who have a trauma response adaptation, that can be something that someone who's going through an experience like this for the first time can really gain a lot of support from. If there's somebody in your community who, isn't able to get out, who has mobility limitations, obviously that's something that we can create mutual support networks for. And then also, how do we kind of like map those resources, again, at the individual level, within like a household unit, within a neighborhood unit, within a sub-demographic or an identity group, that can then scale up for a regional response. If we know to anticipate that there will likely be another peak in the fall for the COVID, for example, a lot of the adaptive role of hypervigilance can really serve to help prepare, so that rather than having this like low-lying feel of panic, we can look to people who have already built the tools to manage that experience of hypervigilance, and to learn both like the self-care techniques, again, those adaptive practices, to be able to be prepared ourselves to be more responsive when it comes again. And part of that responsiveness is being able to not overwhelm our healthcare systems, and to be able to get like physical response and get physical care in those times.
Yeah, so I also thank you guys for your input, Tyler and Em. I know that like everybody has been on like Zoom meetings for a million years, and like this is another form of adaptation, right? Like this is what I'm struggling with. Or like I'm like trying to get some human contact, and Zoom is a really odd one, an odd way to do it. And so I really want to just say out loud that we really appreciate having you guys here, and appreciate you kind of rolling with like all of these questions and these ideas. The next portion has a little questionnaire that I'm going to pop into the chat. It has, so this one is, and let me know if that works for people. You can just give me a little thumbs up if it opens up. Cool, great. So this little questionnaire has two sections. The first section is private and anonymous. And it's just a little quick response on what people's different experiences are, just so you can kind of get a metric on that for our archives, and so that we know when we're having these discussions, who's present, like who's in the room. But those are anonymous, so feel free. Feel free to share. We can take 2 minutes now to fill that out, and then I'll call you back.
Great. I'm just popping in the box. Also, we have a little playlist that we send out as S2 that sometimes we like to share or we find is helpful for folks who like to have music in the background. It's inspired by our quarterly themes and our quarterly work. So if you like having music on, I'm going to pop that in the box.
Curated by our very own Tyler, just saying.
Got him.
So I also wanted to say this Zoom call or whatever this is, this Google Hangouts call is scheduled till 3:45. I'm going to stay on longer and hold space if people want to talk more when we're finished. Great. Cool. Got a couple messages. Other people, you can hold up a finger if you're finished with the first section. Sweet. Great. Okay, moving right along. So our second section has 3 questions, and these questions are designed specifically to sort of give us an idea when we do mapping. What we are trying to do is figure out where resources are, where we need them, and where they're actually going. Does that make sense? So like when we think about resiliency, being able to develop these skills, these like trauma adaptive skills, is awesome. That's a great goal. But we know that there are certain places in the city, there's certain communities that don't have the same access to those things. And so the next section of this questionnaire is talking about that specifically. So rather than an idea of access or an idea of adaptiveness, this is like a personal question just to ask you guys where you are seeing the actual resources. So there are 3 questions. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? It's like the next section in the questionnaire. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so the 3 questions are, when might trauma services be needed? So trauma services can be quite a couple different things. So you're welcome to list, that can be emergency services, that can be emergency mental services, hotlines, things like that. It can also be community support. There's a lot of ways you can think about that. So feel open in responding to that. Where are resources available? And this, just bang out a list, just like whatever comes to your mind first, what you know of, whether or not you need it personally. And the next question is, are these resources accessible? What might be barriers? How can these barriers be addressed? An example would be, let's say there's one place in a neighborhood that is for response to mental crisis or emotional crisis, but there's no ramp. So it's not accessible by wheelchair, right? Things like that. That's a really physical example. There's other access examples too. Yeah, please.
Something I just want to add to this as we're going through this activity is you can be generic with your response. So you can say like community resource center, things like that, but you can also be specific. Bye, David.
Thanks, David.
You can also be specific. So for example, I might list like my therapist's office or something like that. And what we will do with this is we'll compile all of the findings for this from this conversation, as well as those who contribute offline, and create a resource list that we can share back with the community. And use this as a starting point to actually have like a resource list.
Great. Is that clear to everybody? Does it feel good? Great. Feel free to keep filling it out. Just as much as you want to put in there, go ahead and put in there. You don't have to submit it before the conversation. We have a few minutes, and I just wanted to give everybody an opportunity because this is an anonymous thing, and we'll send it out as a resource map. But if there's anything you guys wanted to share with each other, things that came up for you, things that you're feeling concerned about, things you're surprised by.
Something that came up for me filling this out was talking about individual needs, but also community level needs. And I'm able to identify where individual services might be available, but I'm curious about where services might be available at a group level, specifically for kind of therapeutic processing.
One thing I want to mention that I thought was kind of interesting to see becoming more active is like these hyper specific community groups on Facebook. Some that I'm a part of, let's see, for example, like there's actually a barista guild of Seattleites. So all baristas in Seattle kind of are on this Facebook page, or at least can be. And obviously, because of the pandemic, a lot of our positions were lost because 90% of cafes are closed. And that just brought like a really authentic emotional response that we just saw online, where people were coming together and almost counseling each other. And I found that very, resonating, and just like seeing how quickly something like that can come forward and pop up, where people were checking in with each other, people we've never met, don't know, but we're still, active on ensuring that, resources are met, people have the information that they need to like sort of face this issue together. So that was very therapeutic, I guess, to see at the community level.
Something I was thinking of, also to touch on that prompt you gave us earlier, thinking about things at like an infrastructural level, a community level, a personal level, thinking about infrastructure trauma and like what that means for the people who are in leadership positions, and just wondering what that is like, if there are people that give guidance, or if that's already built into leadership positions, things like that. That's just something I'm thinking about that is a knowledge gap for me. I also wanted to say, would love to hear your voices if you haven't spoken up yet. No pressure, but I wanted to explicitly invite you.
Hi, it's Sarah. She, her. Kind of on the Facebook subject, I have noticed a lot more people using technology of various kinds to connect in a way that a lot of them have never before. An example, it's powwow season. So, huge cultural events all over the country. It's a spiritual event. It's a place where artists show their wares. There's just this it's a very community building activity that is not possible right now. So a couple of men, I think from North Dakota, started a Facebook social distance powwow. And I think they're up to something like 180,000 members. And so dancers and artists and photographers, just anybody that would normally be in the powwow community is able to upload videos of them dancing or giving prayers or messages of support. And it's something that wouldn't have happened but for the pandemic. So I thought that was pretty wonderful and something new.
That makes me think about something that we were talking about today. My name's Willow, she, her. And we were talking about the Landforms dance performance that was happening over this past weekend, and how it's like this drive-through dance performance. And so you have this personalized experience because it's just your car, whoever's in the car with you. And you have, through your technology, a playlist, you get your instructions on where to drive, and how this feeling that people who have different levels of comfortability and preferences with in-person interaction, and how this is opening up more types of interacting, and how interacting in person has this more value. It's like more sacred, and it's like it's always been there, but now we have this chance to really see that, and also see how easy it is to connect with people who are really far away through technology that we had access to before, but we weren't. I mean, I'm sure plenty of people were using it, but it's like now we're all using it, like probably more than we maybe want to, But like that seems like one of those things that in a resilient response, like an immediate response to just try and maintain what we need to be accomplishing, that there's maybe some things that come through that are worth keeping, and what are those, and that people who are used to navigating high levels of anxiety, often I think in times when it is externally also that, like the idea that being able to go with the flow, it like means different things when the flow is like the rapids, right? And so I think that people can have creative ideas that maybe wouldn't really be looked to in that role necessarily, and just opens up a lot more possibility, I think. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Thanks for putting that up in the chat.
Yeah, for sure. I also added the social distance powwow link. Thank you guys so much for filling that out and for your contributions. We're at 3:50, so I just want to give us a little moment to wrap. Tyler, I was going to toss it to you real quick to just talk briefly about membership and COVID response.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. During this unprecedented moment, your contribution to Sustainable Seattle really allows for the quick distribution of resources needed in times of emergency and crisis. We have centered our priorities to meet this moment by disseminating critical information and resources, and engaging at the community level through these digital discussions and our resiliency-led projects that we're putting forward in the next few. And we're constantly developing new pathways to connect and push for sort of continued environmental justice during this time, and sort of at all times. We recognize that this is a time of emergency, but we critically acknowledge that climate change and other environmental disasters put us in a predictable phase in which another disaster may occur, and making sure we are connecting community where it's needed most is quintessential. So by making a pledge to S2, you're contributing to Pathways for Greater Community Alignment, and building a more sustainable, equitable, and vibrant Seattle. So right now, we have our membership going for $20 a month. That is actually a $5 bump increase than our usual rate, which is intended to contribute to our COVID-19 relief fund, which is connected to some of the other partnership incubator companies that we work with that represent the frontline communities, and other resources that we are trying to support in the best ways we can through such direct action. So wherever you can contribute, that is greatly appreciated. It goes a very long way. So we really thank you for your time and just staying connected with us.
The last thought that I'll share is that please keep an eye out. Like I said, we're going to summarize our findings from this conversation and other things that come out, and we'll produce, we'll kind of share stuff either later this week or early next week. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you for all of the thoughts that you've shared. You've given us a lot to think about, and I just have so much appreciation, especially because, as I've said, this topic is very near and dear to my heart, for you all engaging in this with us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. If you want to, I am going to be putting one last thing in the chat, or two last links, which are our COVID response project. Very quick, there's a little questionnaire to, again, help us just do like a really hyper-local census. And then there's a prompt, a weekly prompt. Then we're asking actually for people's audio responses, so that we can start to like generate an oral history of like what's going on for people during this time. So I'll stick those in there. Feel free to check them out. They're on our website as well. You can get them from our email list. So yeah, thank you guys so much. I'll be on here for a few more minutes if people have questions. But yeah, thank you so much. This input is really helpful. This is really inspiring little conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.